Hi, thank you for joining us today. We have Patricia Bosworth, author of The Men in My Life, a memoir of love and art in 1950s Manhattan. We are so thrilled to have you here today, Patricia, and we are all huge fans of this book. We've read it, we've loved it, but we'd love to hear from you today. We would love to hear what you think about the book, your process in writing it, what it's about, and then, of course, we'll be hearing some questions from your fans and some viewers. But if you'd like to kick it off with a little bit of a passage from the book, we'd love to hear it.
Thank you. I'd like to read it. This is from the very beginning, the preface. For most of my life, I've been able to hide my feelings. Indeed, I'd have to say I've been virtually defined by my ability to hold back until now. I call this memoir The Men in My Life because two of the principal characters, my father, the lawyer Bartley Crum, and my brother Bart Jr., were the first men I cared for passionately, and who passionately cared for me. When I was very young and struggling to be both an actress and a writer, my brother shot himself in the head, and 6 years later, my father took an overdose of sleeping pills. How did I just survive their deaths? By shutting down completely. And this book is really sort of the telling of what I did after. It takes, as you've said, the 10-year period from 1953 to 63, I guess the most tumultuous years of my life. It was a period of empowerment for me, of learning how to take care of myself. But basically it was coping with these suicides, and I became a suicide survivor. And as a suicide survivor, I also became a workaholic, because most suicide survivors are workaholics. They work to assuage their grief and their sense of loss and anger and shame about the suicides. And that's what I did. And in this period, I got married and divorced. I graduated from college. I became an actress. I became a member of the Actors Studio. I then worked on Broadway and television, and I ultimately became a writer by the end of '63. And at the same time, in this book, I also write about how I met every single subject of my biographies. Montgomery Clift was my first biography, and I met him because my father was his lawyer. And I met him when I was 15, and I never forgot him. I met Brando at the Actors Studio. I met Jane Fonda because we both studied with Lee Strasberg. And, of course, we bonded, especially because she's a suicide survivor. Her mother slit her throat when she was 12, so that was a dark connection for both of us. And then I also met Arbus, Deanne Arbus, the photographer. I modeled for her when I was a teenager. And she called me her teenage bride because she had been a teenage bride, and she was very sort of struck by that about me, wanted to know all about it. And so I got to know her and, of course, was very intrigued with her because she was such a special personality. But in this period, I mean, I can't describe to you what it's like to write a biography. I mean, it's hard to describe. It's very intense, very emotional, because you can't be indifferent to your own history, and I was not indifferent. It was a really emotional period for me as I wrote this book. I was constantly crying and laughing and reliving memories because, the more memories you have, the more you know you have lived, and that's what that's what I really was interested in depicting my memories, depicting the time also, the 1950s, which is a very repressive time, and I was very adventurous in that time. I sort of went against what was going on. It was a repressive, silent era where you couldn't talk about anything, and you're just supposed to get married. Women were supposed to be married and have children, and I didn't want to do that right away, although I did get married, but I didn't have children. I wanted a career. I wanted to be both an actress and a writer. I had these dual ambitions because Colette, the famous novelist, had also been an actress when she began, and she was sort of one of my inspirations, and Mary McCarthy was another inspiration. Mary McCarthy, who was really a sexual adventuress, and this book is a lot about sexuality, about women's sexuality, because then, in this time, the 1950s, women weren't supposed to talk about their sexuality. They weren't supposed to be free. Sexually. They didn't know about their bodies at all. There was no kind of sexual education the way there is now. I remember my mother, when I got my period, she gave me a sanitary napkin and then the stories of Colette, because she thought that she wanted me to know about love and sex but from a fictional point of view, and she didn't really want to talk to me about what it's like to live in a woman's body. So that the book is about growing up sexually, emotionally, taking charge of my life. I started earning my living when I was 19, and that too was sort of unusual in those days. And I was going to college at the same time, and my classmates couldn't get over the fact that I also worked. I also was learning about money. I was learning about everything. I mean, this was a huge learning experience for me, this era. When you're in your 20s, you usually live by your instincts. I think I did, by my emotions. I wanted to do everything. I didn't know how. But again, this for me was, I guess, a period of enormous growth. I had wonderful teachers. Wonderful teacher, Bessie Schoenberg, my dance teacher, taught me something very important. When I first got to college, I said to her, I want to do everything. I want to act, I want to write, I want to dance. And she said, yes, that's wonderful. But first, you have to learn how to concentrate. And I honestly didn't know what that meant. I do now. But I think it was a very, very important lesson for me to learn. I also had a lot of fun, even though there was a lot of darkness in this particular part of my life, because I was meeting so many amazing people. I worked with Tennessee Williams. I did The Glass Menagerie. I played Laura opposite Helen Hayes, so I met one of the great playwrights of the 20th century, Tennessee Williams. I met Gore Vidal at the same time, because Gore came backstage opening night. And I met Kazan. I guess Kazan was my most important mentor for me. He was one of the leaders, the heads of the Actors Studio, and I met him when I was very young. And I really invested myself in his work. I studied every one of his movies, On the Waterfront, East of Eden, Streetcar Named Desire, of course, because, he was one of the great directors of the 20th century. He directed both Arthur Miller and Tennessee Williams. And I wanted to know how he did it. Of course, you can't really know. You can't know about art. It's mysterious. But I did learn a lot from him, and I think what I learned most was the way he responded to everything, his curiosity, his very sharp intelligence, his need to know was also important for me to watch, to listen to him. And I think that for me, he and I guess my father was the other really important man in my life, because my father was a lawyer, left-wing lawyer in California who defended the Hollywood 10 and who worked for Truman and ultimately worked for Robert Kennedy. What I learned from my father was his sense of honor and principles and conscience and his decency. He was an example to me of a really unique human being who tried to do for others. But I can't leave out my mother either. My mother was a novelist. She had been a crime reporter on the Call Bulletin, very ambitious woman. But she lived at a time when women did not really have many careers. But she was extremely important to me. Both my parents were. And I think the most important thing was that they gave me love and support. And they told me I could do anything I wanted, which is nice to hear from your parents, from your authority figures. But I'd love to hear from people who are listening, if I can answer any questions about my life so far and what I've learned and gained, because I think my life has been incredible. And basically, I wanted to share these experiences with everybody, because I think that some of them were important, some of them were culturally important even. Because I lived in a very repressive time. I experienced marital abuse. I had an abortion. during a time when these things were not talked about. They were taboo subjects. And now they're not taboo subjects, they're talked about, but I'm worried about the repression in this administration with Donald Trump, that we may be returning to this era, an era of repression. I hope that doesn't happen, because I think there is also a lot of rebellion. But as I say, I'd love to hear what people would like to ask me about my book.
Patricia, I have a question for you. Just referencing what you just mentioned about how stories like this are very important now in this day and age. Who specifically are you hoping is going to be reading your book? Who is the audience that you, even though you're telling your own story, who did you have in mind when you were writing it, that you wanted them to pick this up, find it, connect with it?
Well, of course, it's a woman's story. I believe it's a woman's story. I think there's a lot that women can identify with in every way, because I think I've lived archetypical experiences, be it marriage, falling in love, trying to have a career, fulfilling my ambitions. I would say it was directed to women, but oddly enough, a lot of men have been reading it too.
Well, I think, as you mentioned, there's so many great stories in here. Culturally, it's very important, and anyone who connects with those personalities that you've mentioned and that you've been in touch with over the years can really connect with this book as well. Who are you currently, in terms of theater, film, etc.? I mean, who are some of the contemporary actors and actresses that you really think are setting the stage for those cultural moments right now? Is there anybody in particular that you're thinking of?
Well, of course I have to say Meryl Streep,
Right, of course,
who, you know, is to me one of the most impressive and remarkable talents and women in the world. I mean, every time I hear her talk, and of course when I see her act, she's just truly a bravura actress. I think I'm very proud to even be in the same room with her, which I've only been once in my life. I think she's somebody that women emulate, men admire. She takes chances, she's outspoken. She seems to have done everything, but in the best sense of the word. You know, she's been a wonderful wife, mother, and great artist. So I admire her very much. Oh, and then, gosh, let's see. Who else? I love Diane Keaton. I think she's very special, very quirky, following her own drummer, so to speak. I think she does what she wants. She's very eccentric, but again, in the best sense of the word, she too is somebody I admire, because she not only is an actress, she's a photographer, she designs houses, she has used her talents to the fullest, and also she wrote the most beautiful book about her mother. She gives her mother total credit for everything that she became as a woman, as an artist, and I admire her very much for that. Let's see, who else? There are some directors I love who are no longer around, like John Huston. Again, I'm attracted to talents who can do all sorts of things, all sorts of kinds of movies. I love, for example, Austin Pendleton, who's a friend of mine but a colleague, and I revere him because he wears three hats. He writes, he directs, he acts, and I too think that's a wonderful way to live your life as an artist, to juggle, to play different roles as an artist. Who else? Of course, I greatly admire Michelle Obama and President Obama, and I was touched and sort of dazzled in a way when I read today that Obama is living in Tahiti, because I wrote about Tahiti when I wrote my biography of Brando, and he is staying at the Brando Hotel writing his book. And I think that's terrific that he's relaxing and having a good time after his many, I think, remarkable years as our president.
It's interesting that you just mentioned that, because that leads into another slightly related, but different question. In terms of writing, a writing process, you were talking about how emotional writing this specific book was. But in terms of the day-to-day process of your writing process, what does that entail? You know, where do you go? How long does this take you? How long every day do you write? Or what is that like?
Well, it's different at different times. When I'm writing a book, as I was writing this one, I wrote 8 drafts of the book. I never stopped working on the book. But right now, I'm sort of, I don't like to say limbo, but maybe I am. I am moving into different projects. I'm about to start writing an article about when I first started earning my living. I'm going to be writing an article on celebrity divorces, but the actual way I write is I usually go to my office quite early in the morning. I mean, before Jamie comes, who's my wonderful assistant, and I very often will write in my journal first thing in the morning, write about what had happened to me the day before, my thoughts, my feelings. I've had recently a number of my good friends are having health problems, which worries me a lot. I was writing about them this morning, as a matter of fact. But I go from my journal to sometimes note-taking for a specific article, and I'm like, for example, trying to figure out what I want to write next as a book. So I'll be writing notes. It's mainly writing notes right now. Writing notes, reading. I read a great deal. And then finally, when I have to start actually writing, I will sit and I will just write for as long as it takes to complete an article, an essay. In this instance, I'm going to be maybe outlining a new book. I try to write every day. I really do write every day. I think it's like the habit of art, so to speak. I'm in the habit of writing. I always have a pad with me. I take it with me in my purse. If I don't have the pad, I get really very upset. I will pull, a napkin, when I'm at a diner or something, and start scribbling on the napkin. I am sort of compulsively needing to do the act of writing.
That's really interesting, and it's great to know. I'm sure there's a lot of aspiring writers watching and following your career, but I think that's really important to know that it's the habit of writing, the habit of art. I love that
the habit of art, which is a Flannery O'Connor phrase. Yeah. I also love pictures. I love photographs. I have a huge bulletin board which is filled with images, because images are also part of your memory. You remember various visual things in your memory, or can collect them. And I love photographs. My last husband was a photographer. I'm actually working on finishing a book that I organized of his work. But I adore photographs. I just saw an exhibit last night of Magnum photographs, and that was very interesting to me. I follow photography. I love images. I just love to look at pictures. Mm-hmm. Got them all over.
Well, speaking of images, I'm glad you said that, because I was going to ask you about the cover of your book. It's very striking. Many people here and consumers, et cetera, have mentioned it. They've asked about it. But who is that striking woman on the cover of the book? Well,
that's me. I know the whole story, and it is it's an amazing story. This was taken of me when I was 25 years old, not at the Actors Studio. I'm in my little apartment on East 66th Street, but this is what happened. The man who took this photograph's name was Paul Slade, and he was a Paris Match photographer. And I was going with a friend of his named Michel Duplay. They were both Paris Match photographers. Paris Match is a great photo magazine, and actually magazine in France. Anyway, it's like a Life magazine. Anyway, Paul had come to New York he's American, but he was living in Paris. Paul had come to New York to photograph young actresses from the Actors Studio. And I was chosen. I think others were chosen too, but he took pictures of me at the Actors Studio. There's a picture that he took of me with Lee Strasberg. He took about 100 photographs of me, which are now in Getty Images. The art director of HarperCollins found them. I don't know how. It's listed Patricia Bosworth, Getty Images, Actors Studio. And there's this enormous range of pictures of me in my apartment, rehearsing scenes, at the Actors Studio, walking down the street. It's just an amazing documentation, and I had forgotten that Paul Slade had taken this picture. Of course, now I remember, but that's the history of that picture.
That's amazing. That's very full circle for this
Yes.
memoir for you, I think. That's
Oh,
a really
yeah.
nice story
it was,
to hear.
It was amazing.
Yeah.
It's truly amazing.
That's great. So you were discovering things, on your own while you're writing. You're telling your story, but you're also
That's right.
uncovering
And to
new
have
things.
this documented, this
That's
period
great. That's
by
great.
Paul, it was just amazing.
Yeah,
And
well, it's a beautiful photo, and I think it, we were talking about it earlier, it so represents you as both a writer and actress, a young woman in New York City. There's so
That's
much that
right.
comes through in such a simple photo.
I know.
It kind of tells the story right
I
there,
know.
which is great.
I know.
So we're thrilled to have this photo, and we're thrilled to the Harper Art Department who uncovered it. We'll have to give them a little shout out. And I do have another question for you. You've touched on a few things here, but what advice would you have for young women in New York City, young writers, young actors? I mean, obviously while you're writing this, you're telling a great story, you're telling a lot of lessons you've learned, but if someone came up to you right now, didn't know your story, what would you say to them about, surviving as a young professional or young actor, writer in the city? I mean, it's tough. It's a challenge. But what would you say to them?
Well, first of all, you have to be very tough. You really do, because it's almost impossible. I think you need to have a support group. By that I mean friends who are doing the same thing you're doing, so you can exchange opinions and ideas and can complain and kvetch. And you definitely need a support system, which I had through the Actors Studio. It was like my second home. I was able to go there and ask all sorts of questions that couldn't be asked anywhere else. But you have to really love your work and be willing to be really courageous about holding on to your dream and trying to fulfill it. And I think luck has a lot to do with it. I think showing up is half the battle. I mean, 80% of getting there is really being very, very disciplined about what you're doing. Oh, that's why I'm sorry I was late today. No, but seriously, I really think you have to be disciplined if you want to be an artist. You can't just slough it off. I mean, you have to know your lines. And I remember once I didn't prepare for something, and boy, did I regret it. I never made that mistake again. I just didn't prepare enough. You have to work very hard. I think you have to know that you're going to be working very hard all your life to achieve what you want to achieve. I don't know. I mean, it's tough.
That's great.
It's no easy. It's not easy.
It's not easy. No. But I like that, showing up. It's simple, but it's
showing up, just
absolutely
being
true.
there,
Yeah.
being there, and knowing what you're going to do when you show up.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Have a plan.
Yeah, have a plan. Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for showing up today. We appreciate it. We're so happy that you were here. I know there's a lot of readers and fans out there that have already discovered this book, but hopefully from you doing this video with us today, we'll have a lot more readers on board. And I know we'll look forward to a lot more from you to come and all these projects that you're working on. We thank you very much for giving all of that to us and sharing your story.
Thank you. I'm very glad to have been here.
All right. Well, thanks for being here, and we'll hear more from you soon, we hope. Thanks.